For me, the autonomy, mastery, purpose stuff is really about why you get out of bed in the morning. This is how we have decided that there's something important for me to do, that I'm excited to wake up. And, autonomy really is about having a say in how you spend your day. Most people don't want to be told how to do everything that they do. They want to address problems creatively. They want to be self-directed and to figure out the best means of accomplishing something.
Welcome to the Next Insights podcast, intersecting science, technology, and consciousness. I'm your host, Michael Morrissey, strategic futurist and founder of Next CoLabs. This podcast explores the transformative potential of generative AI and its many applications for personal, professional, and business growth. Join us where we celebrate the next insights, those aha moments that shift your point of view and open the door into the next paradigm. You'll hear the latest ideas and thought-provoking conversations with industry experts, authors, thought leaders, equipping you with the strategies to harness the relentless pace of change in the AI era. Whether you're a CEO, leader, or interested in personal growth, this podcast will give you the insights to leverage AI to amplify human potential and consciously shape the future for humanity first. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to another episode of the Next Insights podcast. I'm excited to have Roy Vella, our CEO at Next CoLabs, back on the show. Today, we're talking about one of Roy's favorite books, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel Pink. Thanks for joining us, Roy, and how are you today?
My pleasure. Good to be back. Good to see you. All's well.
Roy, this is a book that we hosted in our thought leadership community, Book Flow, only a week ago. Really a fascinating book. We actually did it on Valentine's Day because it is one of your favorite books. When did you discover this book? And tell us a little bit about, I think more importantly, just before we dive into the book, tell us about the fact that you're a voracious reader. Many of us in our community are. And tell us about, leaders are readers and what's your reading habit? You read so many articles every day and you posted them to our, community feed and to your LinkedIn. Tell us about your reading habit.
Sure. I think humans are innately curious. We are, as we've discussed before, Max Tegmark, we're upgrading each other's software all the time. We evolve our hardware, but we're upgrading our software in a constant basis. And since the printing press, people have been sharing what they think with others. And I've always been like that. I just love to be exposed to new ideas. I read both fiction and nonfiction. I think fiction is really interesting access to another's imagination. What I love about fiction is the way I view fiction is that an author gets to paint in my imagination, which I think is kind of fascinating, right? Like we tend to read fiction and like it or not, we have a visualization usually of what's happening, of the characters, of where they are, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, we evaluate movies on how close they match our internal visualization, right? Like if the movie is a close approximation of how we visualized it, then we love it. We're like, oh, that was really good. But the movie locks it in. Like this is the way it's visualized now, where when you're reading, you have a huge landscape, right? And also what's interesting is that things are loose until the author describes something. So the character might not have a height until they mention it. They might not have a hair color until they mention it. You might not understand the environment they're in. So I love that feeling of sort of things are cloudy and vague and out of focus until they are in focus. All of a sudden now I know what that's like or blah, blah, blah. And on the nonfiction front, I think it's like this book, Drive, there's just so much to learn. And in fact, one of the things I love about this book is it is really a curative book. It's curation. He is not presenting novel insights necessarily in terms of his own research. It's about saying, look at all of this research and history and look at all we've learned over time about this topic. And what he's really doing is refining it and curating it into a readable, memorable, motivational form, right? Where we go, okay, I get it now. I understand what that is, how that is, and how it applies to my life. And that was one of the greatest things about this book is that it resonates, right? People read it and they go, yeah, I feel that. I recognize that it is apparent in my life that that is true. So yeah, and on the daily, yes, I mean, I get a lot of newsletters. A lot crosses my feed. I'm a pretty good distiller myself in that regard. Like frankly, one of the secrets, the title, the opening paragraph, the closing paragraph, and then you decide how deep you need to go into the rest. I mean, literally, you kind of can get on the 80-20, you get 80% of it from the title, the opening paragraph, and the closing paragraph. In the middle, then you decide, okay, how much deeper do I want to go into this? And frankly, that's one of the beauties of how we write, is that we make information more accessible by using paragraphs, by using titles, by using sections. Like, you can digest a book by reading the outline first, and the outline is apparent in the layout of it, and the same with articles, right? Every article that I read every word of every article that I post to our community feed? No. I get the gist of it. And then I go, is it important for me to understand? And so I would say, again, on the 80-20, I probably fully read 20% of what's posted, but I recognize the value of 100%. I'm like, this is an important thing for us to feed into our machine of thought leadership and how we view the world and engage in conversation about it.
That's why I'm doing this podcast, the Next Insights podcast.
Sure.
That was a great insight about how you kind of work through an enormous number of articles and then just find the ones that kind of resonate by using the 80-20 approach. That's huge.
Yeah.
That is now a part of my workflow. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I evaluate a writer on that, on how deep they force me to go. So, okay writer, I can get away with title, opening, closing, and I got the gist. An in-depth thinker, I read the whole thing, and there are a number of guys who cross my radar where I read everything they write, and I read every word that they write because there's no extra words. They're not repeating themselves. There's new insights throughout, which is, worth the time and effort to actually read everything.
Remarkable. I love that. Okay. So on this book, I mean, I guess when was the first time? This was written in 2009. And just fast forward to 2024. A lot has changed.
Yeah.
And yet, in a way, this was like prescient at that time when it came out. And as you said, there's something empirical about this book, and that is now backed by science.
Sure.
That just resonates with all of us very deeply, that goes beyond extrinsic motivation and moves into something that's almost like our soul, is related to intrinsic motivation. When did you first discover the book? And then we'll talk about maybe a 3-part kind of approach to sort of analyzing the book.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been a fan of Dan Pink since he crossed my radar. So before this book, I think I probably read it in 2010, 2011, I want to say. I don't think I read it immediately when it came out, but soon thereafter, because I do find Dan's distillation very insightful and also very concise in a certain way. I mean, he's taking reams of scientific studies and data and experiments and anecdotes and putting them into a very concise, readable form that's fun to read, right? And he's very good at interjecting sort of the anecdotes with the studies and what they mean, So, yeah, I would say I read it fairly early on and it resonated deeply with me as well. And I keep it in mind. And I tell my kids, I think it applies to all aspects of life, not just work. And also that's the interesting thing about it, right? I think this line between what we define as work and not work, work and play, work and leisure is an interesting phenomenon. That's a fairly modern phenomenon, which is part of his message, right? That this is
work and life.
Well, so that's the funny thing. Like, we say work is not life, but that's the majority of our time for a lot of people. So what does that mean, right? Like, if life is the time I'm not working and not sleeping, that's not a lot of time. Like, that's a little concerning.
Okay, let's look at the book from the point of view of like an overarching structure. The book is broken into like 3 sections. He starts with, the first opening around a new operating system. And he talks about motivation 1.0, 2.0, and then 3.0 as intrinsic motivation. So we'll look at that. And then we'll pivot to kind of the middle section, really the heart of motivation 3.0, AMP, which you're very fond of using when you describe even Next CoLabs and the 5 pillars of Next CoLabs: autonomy, mastery, purpose, flow, and collaboration. So we'll look at those first 3. And then we'll finish up with, I would say, the AI moment and how, in a way, as a kind of, let's say, an enabler of motivation 3.0 And he calls it type I motivation, that if AI does the 80% heavy extrinsic lift, that kind of opens the door to the realization of this concept of the third drive in the workplace. So let's start with, the backstory on a new operating system. A little bit about the history. I think you talked about the idea of even work itself as almost like a factory approach, an assembly line to optimize for productivity was at the expense of, some level of our innate intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think so. That's the funny part. It's a new operating system, but it's sort of the original operating system, right? The original operating system, people didn't have a boss. People didn't make you get up and hunt and gather and take care of your children and build your shelter and all of that. The extrinsic motivators were the environment. You were in an environment where you needed to survive and grow, and you wanted to raise a family or whatever. What I was saying, it is interesting. The industrial age and industrial production changed a lot of things. I mean, it invented, frankly, the 5-day work week, the 8-hour work day. The idea that there's work and I travel to it, and then there's not work that is, a home place and someplace else. I see that as like a schism that happened sort of in the mid 1800s, where all of a sudden we went from 99% entrepreneurship, which, let's be clear, like our ancestors, pretty much all entrepreneurs. It was a barter system, and then it went to a monetary system. But fundamentally, I made things. I was a farmer, or I was a carpenter, or I was a plumber, whatever it was, whatever my crafts were, we were all tradespeople, and we transacted via our trade. And how did you find your trade? Intrinsically. Like, it was either in your family and people taught you through an apprenticeship, or externally, you were drawn to something. I want to be a blacksmith. I want to be you were drawn to it intrinsically, and then you learn the trade. And, it wasn't until the only people who weren't that were basically soldiers, right? Like soldiers were the first real large scale organizations, that were owned and hired by a king and paid to be that. Everyone else was an entrepreneur. And then in the mid 1800s, all of a sudden mass production started to happen. Like this idea of like, okay, I'm going to have a factory, and people are going to come to my factory, and they're going to, instead of do their entrepreneurship, they're going to do this, and I'm going to pay them to do that. And that whole thing kind of shifted the intrinsic extrinsic balance, right? I would say it was heavily weighted to intrinsic. And then the industrial age comes, and the extrinsic, and all of a sudden this idea of carrots and sticks, of not being hit by the stick or hoping for the carrot, became a part of our existence. One of the interesting things about the book is, the research into monkeys and to other creatures, and the sense of fairness that primates have, and motivation in that regard. It's going way back to our original operating system. The reason Dan calls it a new operating system is that he's saying it with respect to the one that we've been using for 150, 200 years, right? He's like, we've had an operating system of work and not work that was really about the carrot and the stick. And what he elucidates through a bunch of studies and examples is like, that's just not true. A lot of the things are not true. You have assumptions about carrots and sticks, and then you implement them, and you get the exact opposite of what you wanted. I mean, we could talk about a few of his funny stories, but there's, the reality of the way humans evaluate how they spend their time. For instance, you put a monetary value on time. Sometimes people will pay that instead of previously, when there was no monetary, it was more of a moral judgment. You move a moral judgment to a monetary judgment, and you get the wrong output. He was talking about picking up kids late. I think it was in Israel where, earlier picking up kids late, you were inconveniencing the teacher, and you had a relationship with the teacher, and there was intrinsic motivation to, be in a good relationship with your kid's teacher. Then they said, okay, there's a fine if you pick your kids up late. You have to pay, and here's how much it costs, and we're going to add it to your monthly bill. And people were like, so I can just pay for the extra time. Great. Now the intrinsic interaction went away. So late pickups increased, right? Because you made it a monetary transaction. And he has tons of anecdotes and stories in the book that you go, right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like that's what's going to happen when you do certain things and you don't recognize the intrinsic transaction, which is generally an interpersonal transaction versus a monetary transaction, right?
It's interesting that he starts the book by, citing work that was done by Edward Deci in 1969, building on the work of Harry Harlow on motivation theory. They're both behavioral scientists steeped in psychology. And I think Deci was working on his PhD and, had sort of surfaced the work that Harlow had done and put away back in the 40s, brought it back up to the surface and realized that actually, let's say he'd call it motivation 1.0 is biological kind of needs like food, water, sex. That's a given. We know that. And then the second level of motivation would be extrinsic drive, reward and punishment, carrot and stick. And that the paradox you've just described is that what they discovered was in fact, actually that was demotivation.
Right. Exactly.
And then the discovery of what, he surfaced at that time was the idea of the third drive. And then fast forward to, this book in 2009. And now we have Dan Pink, who's just got that ability to, in a sense, bring it into the mainstream, into the organization and the company and use the language, the business school language to help frame it. Really fascinating, just that now it is science-backed, evidence-based. So this isn't on the woo spectrum. This is real. And that, as you say, we know inherently this is the case.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's also interesting. It's a bunch of it is, I don't want to hear that. The reason the prior studies in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s kind of surfaced and then went away is that it's hard as a leader. The extrinsic stuff, the carrot stick stuff, the bonus if you get it done by this time, the punishment if you don't, blah, 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 pretty sort of straightforward. And, in certain cases it works, but for the majority of the time it doesn't work. And it works less and less the more creative the output. So if it's a widget, this many widgets by this much time, that is an easy, again, going back to industrial age scale manufacturing, it works. It works partially. I mean, you also can burn people out, people are not machines and they want to know what they're part of and why they're doing it. And they want to be skilled at what they're doing. Right. I mean, we can get into the autonomy, mastery, purpose stuff, but I guess my point is the reaction to those early studies was because it's hard to do. We have a much easier grasp of extrinsic motivators than we do intrinsic motivators, right? It's easier to hire someone without having to understand their inner drives.
And in a sense, from the update to 2024 is that, those intrinsic motivations are related to your unique ability and that you've hired people heretofore based on very narrow bandwidth of who they are. And all of the other aspects of who they are that they do at home as hobbies or like, again, the separation of, who you are from life and work and where your kids, everything's separated. That's like modernity.
Right.
And it's almost like we're moving into a period where we get to bring the parts back together.
Yeah, we reintegrate.
I think we're going through that shift, right?
Yeah, there's a reintegration and a more holistic. And actually what's interesting about COVID is a lot of that happened. There was reintegration because we're in our home offices, because pets come and go, because kids come and go, because things are happening in people's lives that you didn't have access to before, right? Like pre-COVID, there were very distinct physical places between work and home life. And all of a sudden it was forced reintegration of a lot of that, which I thought was a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah, totally. Like when you think about it, the CEO, has got his Tesla outside in a parking spot dedicated to him. He's got the corner office and it's like a rarefied kind of space. And suddenly now we're seeing the CEO at home and with all the stuff that sort of amplifies, who am I? The pets, the wife, the kids, right? And that's now we've actually gone through that threshold where we've almost like humanized everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to, in a sense, almost dehumanizing them to sort of separate them to a very, very narrow bandwidth of specialization. It's so interesting. Specialization is such a powerful thing to do in terms of like productivity and the kind of field effect when you bring all these specialized people into, creating things. But at the same time, we've almost reached the kind of apotheosis of that where we need to actually like reintegrate.
Yeah. The specialization thing is part of the motivation 2.0. So that is true if I want you to rinse and repeat. If I want you to do the same thing again and again and again, then specialization matters. There's a great book called Range David Epstein, and the subtitle, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World.
That's a very Pinkian theme, I would
It's
say.
a very Pinkian theme. And again, this wasn't a title, first chapter, last chapter. I read every page in this book. Really, really fascinating book about the fact that specialists, the idea of specialization is an industrial age thing, right? I want people with range because cross-fertilization is important to creativity and to generating new offerings and concepts and approaches. And, to solve problems, I need cross-fertilization. If someone's sat in their silo, I'm not going to get good answers out of that. They're going to just, they're going to give me the same thing that they gave yesterday, which is what a specialist does, right? By definition. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, he cites Ambele, I believe, from Harvard. Franz Johansson worked closely with her as well, and her whole thesis was around this concept of diversity drives innovation.
Right. Yeah, no, it's 100% true. And it's also fascinating too, when you apply your specialized knowledge to a new area, there's a lot of shock and awe. I've been on boards and advisors to companies in areas where I had no business being, it was a women's maternity clothing company where I was on the board. And I had no experience in fashion or any of that. But the reason was that I kept saying things where the founder was like, I never heard that before. What is it? Say that again. And the idea that I'm sharing was common knowledge in digital banking and payments. But in the women's fashion world, it hadn't hit yet, right? Like, this is the point. Like, the cross-fertilization of ideas is where novelty arises, right? And that's where you start to get interesting new concepts that happen, which is pretty wild.
If you're enjoying this conversation, consider joining the Next Collective to become part of a community actively involved in future-forward innovation. Next Collective is our exclusive membership that puts you at the forefront of AI and conscious thought leadership. With your membership, you'll stay informed with cutting-edge insights, train up on the AI tool sets, gain valuable foresight in what is ahead, and connect with a robust global network of changemakers, early adopters, and leaders. By joining the Next Collective, you're not just investing in your professional growth, you're contributing to a conscious and vibrant future for humanity. It's not just about riding the AI wave, it's about consciously shaping its direction. Ready to be part of the movement? Click the link in the show notes, and as a special bonus for our podcast listeners, use the promo code for a discount on your first month. Let's shape the future together. Now, back to our conversation. Totally fascinating. Well, we're going to revisit this in the third part, this notion of repeatable tasks. And this is in the book. Algorithmic tasks are very related to extrinsic motivation, right? And then we're moving through this kind of like shift, this transformation in real time. We're witnessing it, where work can almost get redefined because the algorithmic could be done by AI. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah. And also the fact that AI is not algorithmic, right? Like, that's one of the most interesting things for me, is that up until this point, our interactions with technologies, with software, is almost purely algorithmic. I know that if I put in A, B is going to come out. That is not AI. If I put in A, I could get B, C, or D. It all depends, right? So mostly in LLMs at the moment, it is not an algorithm. It is a neural network weighting probabilistic system, right? That the output changes. If you ask the same question 3 times to an LLM, you're going to get 3 different answers. It doesn't know how to cut and paste. It is not an algorithm, which is really interesting in the terms of the extrinsic with algorithmic and intrinsic with non-algorithmic. You're like, oh, okay, interesting. There's a change here.
So let's pivot to the 3 aspects: AMP, autonomy, mastery, purpose, and start by distinguishing between what he calls type X versus type I.
Yeah, for me, the autonomy, mastery, purpose stuff is really about why you get out of bed in the morning, right? This is how we have decided that there's something important for me to do that I'm excited to wake up, right? And, autonomy really is about having a say in how you spend your day. People are self-determinant in large part. Most people don't want to be told how to do everything that they do. They want to address problems creatively. They want to be self-directed. That doesn't mean you're just doing anything. It means instead of telling me how to do what you want. Just tell me what you want. And now I'll figure out the most efficient way to do it, right? Like that's what people want. They want to be able to be creative and to figure out the best means of accomplishing something. That has played out in my life. Anytime I've either worked for someone or had someone working for me, that is true. Any creative person wants to be able to create, not just be an automaton.
Well, I love you. You often say, as the CEO of a number of companies, that as a CEO, if I see you doing something that you really enjoy, I'm going to give you more of that.
Totally. 100%. And the exact opposite. If you're suffering, if I give you a task and you're suffering, I'm just going to give it to Joe because he loves that, right? And thank God, we have accountants and we have artists and we have writers and we have people who enjoy all the tasks, right? We're not locked in. And, the more you enjoy a task, it doesn't mean you're not going to have tasks that you don't enjoy. Of course, there's stuff you have to do at work that is not, thrilling you. But in large part, you should be doing stuff that you enjoy doing. That means you're in your zone. Yeah.
So type X behavior is his acronym for extrinsic motivations, carrot and stick model. In a sense, the old rules of work. Fast forward to this moment, the new rules, and the realization of type I motivation. And you wrote on one of your slides relative to your presentation this past week that type I behavior concerns itself less with the external rewards and activity brings, and more with the inherent satisfaction of the activity itself.
Right. Yeah. And that's where our perception of time changes as well. I mean, we can get into flow another time, but if you're in the right zone, you lose time.
Well, I think this is where he gets into, this is actually a nice segue into mastery, because mastery starts to commingle with flow.
Yes.
To stay in the kind of flow channel.
Yeah.
And by kind of repeating tasks and small incremental kind of moments of growth, kind of fosters the sort of mastery channel. Maybe talk a bit about mastery.
I think people mess up mastery with becoming or being a master. That's not what mastery is about. Mastery is about doing something you're good at and constantly getting better at it, getting better at something that matters, right? And you've heard me say this a number of times, it's asymptotic, right? You never quite get there, but it's the striving to get there and doing what you do better that is a real motivator. I mean, let's be clear, Olympians, after winning the gold medal, go back to the gym. There's no such thing as okay, I'm done, and that's a beauty of humanity is we're constantly striving to be a bit better. And there's always room to be better because it's an asymptotic curve, right? Because you just never quite reach that peak level. And when you read about masters, when you read about their life experiences or what they say, you'll often hear that they're like, I know I can be better. I know I'm not quite there. Mozart or Picasso or Einstein, or pick one of the great performers of our lives and times. And they'll all say that. They're all like, yeah, I'm so close. And I know I'm never going to quite get there, but I'm going to I'm hopping out of bed because that drives me. That's a motivator to get better at something you're good at. To get better at something you're great at. You're an Olympian. You're a freaking Olympian and you're still practicing it and you still have a coach. That's the funny part. You think people are peak performers or professional athletes. Why do they have a coach? I think you know enough about this. No, because anyone who's a peak performer knows there's room above them.
I mean, that speaks to the idea of mastery, not as there's no end, that it is a process. And that you embrace that kind of as a process, that the flow, in a sense, becomes the experience.
Yeah. And you're seeking that, right? That's the joy of life is performing at a high level and getting just a bit better every time, right? And feeling that, getting into that zone where you're like, yeah, okay. That was better than last time. Let's do that again. Right. I mean, that's the other thing. You want to do it again. Because you can feel yourself getting closer to the ultimate.
So the one concept that you mentioned, he had three incredible concepts that he weaves through the book. One you just talked about, which is that mastery is asymptotic. Totally fascinating, right? The curve kind of comes up and it never quite reaches that sort of threshold of you're done. But probably when you're done, you are really done.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then the other big idea that kind of, I think, is a great through line in the book is the concept of Goldilocks principle. Maybe talk a bit about that. That's very, very tuned to Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow and this idea of the flow channel and like 4% at a time. Anything beyond 4% growth, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly, you reach overwhelm super quick. And then all of a sudden you become disincentivized, demotivated. So this idea of Goldilocks, talk a little bit about what is that?
People all know the story of Goldilocks, that, the papa's bed was too hard, mama's bed was too soft, and baby's bed was just right. Like blah, blah, blah. That point in the middle between the endpoints. And when it comes down to performance of any type, the Goldilocks zone, if it's too easy, it's boredom. Why am I wasting my time? This is too easy. I'm like, jump over that. It's a foot tall. Like everyone can do that. What's the point? If it's too hard and you fail constantly, that's also demotivating. Then a constant stream of failure makes it such that, like, why am I even bothering to do this? I know I can't do that. The beauty of a good coach is that they make sure you're in the Goldilocks zone. I want you to do this thing that I know you can do, but is incrementally beyond what you've done. My son's a rock climber, and that's the beauty of having graded climbs. Because if you try the top climb, you can't do it. You try the bottom climb, it's like, what am I wasting my time here for? So you're moving up the grades incrementally, right? And what's amazing about that experience in the Goldilocks zone is you're moving. You are moving up the grades. You can see yourself. My son will tell me I climbed a V9 today. Like, he's like, I only did V8s before. This is my first V9, and I only did it once. I couldn't do, like blah, blah, blah. And so this experience of moving, that Goldilocks zone is constantly moving up, again, asymptotically towards your mastery, and it keeps you going. And also, so I'm a rock climber as well. We have a family of rock climbers, and there's a thing in rock climbing called the crux. And when you're on a climb, there's this one move that, like, you work on it, and getting up to it is hard. You get up to it, and now you're like, okay, here I am again. This is the crux of the problem. And I'm working it, and they work the problem is what they talk about. And what's a miracle in rock climbing is once you do it, so once you achieve the crux and you move past it, and then you fall off, you can go right past it again now. You have been working this problem, and now I know how to do it. Like I got it. I know the body. I know the position. I know how to do it. A problem that you worked on for weeks, now you just climb right past it and you're on to the next crux. That's a classic Goldilocks zone. Like it's like a classic sort of incremental.
Well, it really reminds me of the idea of an insight that like you have an insight and then you can't go back. You've already gone past that point where you're not the same person.
Right.
Really.
Which is what we talk about with AI. Like once you start to use it and understand how it's going to improve your life and make things better and faster and easier, you go, I can't go back. Like I'm going to, when was the last time you asked for a typewriter instead of your word processor? Like you don't go backwards, right?
Okay. So I think the emphasis on this is, and we both know this, even like I lift weights 3 days a week as part of my overall, let's say 6 days a week of fitness, 3 are weights. And it's just like an incremental process. It's a process that probably never end. And that's so foundationally, true mastery is a mentally and physically kind of like taxing process. It just is. You have to go through that, the initial stress of the flow cycle, right? To get to flow. But once you're in there, you make that kind of that next level sort of shift to that Goldilocks move to the next 4%. And that's a big part of what mastery is. It's an ongoing process. And if you're not really on the path, unless you're experiencing some challenge, some difficulty, and rinse, repeat. And there's something really powerful about purpose as a kind of like the next level up in this, amp. Talk about purpose.
Purpose for me is we want to feel like we're part of something important, part of something bigger, part of something that involves others, that it's a group function and that you're not doing something that is meaningless. Meaning is a huge part of life. And it used to be largely provided in religious organizations, and nowadays less so, right? I mean, it's first time in U.S. history that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who say none on their religious affiliation is the largest segment now in the U.S. So where are people getting purpose? Where are people getting meaning? And a lot of it is in their daily lives and in what they do when they wake up in the morning. What motivates them? What is the drive? And I love to tell the story, which I think most people have heard, but quickly, like you go up to a guy making a wall. You say, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I lay bricks." And then you go up to another guy. You say, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Well, I'm building a wall. Like I'm part of this. I'm building this wall." And you go up to the third guy and you say, "What are you doing?" He goes, I'm making a cathedral." Right. And that's a difference in purpose. They're doing exactly the same thing. If I measure and I look at exactly what they're doing, same thing, but it's how you define it. What am I part of? And that is, purpose is really about making meaning, that groups of people make meaning together and they see themselves as part of something larger, and cathedrals is a great example. I mean, the people who started building Sagrada Familia in Barcelona knew they weren't going to be alive to see the end of it. I mean, talk about purpose, right? They're like, "Yeah, no, this won't be done till
a century."
Yeah, exactly.
A century to build one of these things.
Yeah.
Right. Fascinating. I think that's another insight.
Yeah.
Just the concept of the three that you described. And finally, I am building a cathedral. I'm participating in something that is greater than myself.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual focus.
That sort of Venn diagram from Pink, autonomy and mastery and purpose all coming together. At the middle is drive, but then there's overlap. Autonomy and mastery is dedication, I think. And then purpose and autonomy is desire, and mastery and purpose is discipline. Like in those three things, desire, discipline, and dedication is what gives you drive. And I think that's just fascinating, right? And it is the way humans, and actually, frankly, it precedes humans as he elucidates in the book, right? Like monkeys even get this.
And think about this relative to, a company, like say Jobs talks about the idea of make a dent in the universe.
Yeah.
These are very, very, very big, kind of almost idealistic concepts, North Stars.
Simon Sinek also talks about that, right? Starting with your why.
Your why.
Exactly.
It's in a sense, you almost have to think so big that it's unattainable, it's beyond asymptotic, right? It's got to be in that. We should do a sort of a composite diagram of this entire conversation because just above asymptotic is your purpose, right? And so that's what it has to be. It has to be something like that from a company or organization's point of view. That's the difference between a mission and the vision.
Yeah. No, the vision is this big, unattainable thing on the other side of the asymptote, but you're always getting closer and closer to it, right? Like that's for sure. And, at the end of the day, this is challenging. I mean, particularly as a leader of a company, giving people autonomy and the opportunity to flex mastery and shared purpose, that's tough. It's much easier to say, we're going to make money and this is about profit and profit per widget and give me more widgets. But that's where you get industries that have massive turnover. Call centers are afflicted by that. The call center, they have 30-40% turnover because they don't deal with any of this. Unless they're like, Tony Hsieh's call center was like, spend as much time with the customer as you need to do the right thing. Like that's autonomy, mastery, purpose, right? And that's why they got acquired by Amazon, I think. Can't remember where. Anyway, yeah. So it's more challenging, but it's also more fulfilling, and you get more loyalty, and you get better work product, and you get happier people who, frankly, they start to have trouble distinguishing between work and not work because they're enjoying themselves, right? If you're enjoying yourself with your colleagues, then work becomes play, and that's a much better scenario, right?
Well, that's a great segue into our, let's say, third kind of area that we want to discuss, which is the update to this book, 2009, 2024. The AI moment in late 2023, and how that, in a way, facilitates the transformation from type X to type I, and moving from, let's say, carrot and stick and work, and even the idea of play is something that you would never talk about at work. Separate that out, please. But could work become more broadly and holistically also play? And is AI going to be able to, do the heavy lift of type X to, in a sense, facilitate and open the aperture to our intrinsic motivation and our unique abilities?
I do think this AI moment is fundamentally about that. It's about automating away. The reason someone had to take notes during the meeting or fill out RFPs the same way, 80, 90% the same every time, because there was no other choice. We needed a human to do it, even though it wasn't really fulfilling for the humans, right? We have the opportunity to let AI augment our creative activity. As I said, it's not an algorithm, right? It is open-ended to a certain extent. And also to automate the repetitive tasks, the stuff that can be automated, we can let an AI take care of that stuff. And what that opens up for me is an opportunity for much more drive, for much more autonomy, mastery, purpose through everything we do, right? It's, I think it's fantastic. It's amazing. And, people are worried about how AI is going to play out, but I think that there's just this massive opportunity to amplify human potential, as we've said, to really get people into a zone where they're thrilled to go to work. And AI is a thought partner who takes over the busy work. And by the way, it's ironic and amusing that we call it busy work. Like all work keeps you busy, but no, we know what busy work means. Busy work means I can turn my brain off and just get it done. Well, if you can turn your brain off and get it done, give it to the AI to do. And then the other stuff that is where we add creative value that we can also help enhance and augment what we do. I think there's just a massive opportunity ahead and we have to embrace it.
That would be the update in the book. I think that the last section of the book is about like a toolkit for how organizations and companies could operationalize this in the next generation of their company, 20 years ago almost now. And here we are, like I'd say this would, at the top of the stack of this section of the book, it would say AI augment your workforce. And in that sense, what you're actually doing from below is you're surfacing their intrinsic motivation and their unique abilities to come to the surface. So that would be the update, I think, to this book. It's really a very good news story.
Totally. Yeah. And just recognizing that carrots and sticks are part of the old way of doing things, right? Like that's, I think he says, it's so last century, right? Like we should move forward, understanding what motivates us, what drives, what gets you out of bed in the morning. And now we finally have an opportunity to offload some of that other knowledge economy work to someone who doesn't mind the repetition. I mean, that was manufacturing too. We were all like, oh God, robots are taking our jobs. Well, they took jobs that were repetitive and giving people stress injuries because of it, but you still need humans involved, right? So I think it's a great book that synthesizes and collates a bunch of research into a really coherent structure that makes a lot of sense and is somewhat easy to implement as a result, as long as you start to consistently pay attention to it.
So if you look at someone like Google and 20% time, they ran that experiment for, I think, over a decade. And Gmail and other things like that kind of came out of 20% time. Maybe talk a little bit about 20% time to kind of finish up and how that might now be able to get transcended by this new moment where the intrinsic isn't just partitioned to, Friday afternoon.
That's exactly what I was going to say. 20% was kind of assuming that the 80% was tedium and blah. And if you gave me some time to really do what I want to do, then I would do creative and interesting things. And what Pink is suggesting and what I think AI enables is, to incorporate your creativity in your daily process, right? And doing stuff that matters at work that does take advantage of your drive, of your autonomy. It gives you the autonomy to do what you need to do that's right for the company. I'll tell you, at PayPal, in the early days of PayPal, the autonomy was massive. I was making decisions as a young person in the organization. I did the largest deal that PayPal had done at the time to drive merchant services. And I didn't have signatory rights. So the VP who signed my deal to make it official, like the day that he was signing, he's like, okay, so tell me what this deal is again. Right? Like that's how much autonomy I had. He was vaguely aware of what I was doing over there. But when the rubber met the road, I was like, okay, here's what we did. Here's the deal. Here's the dynamics. Here's the economics. I walked him through everything. He's like, sounds good. And he signs it and off you go. Like that's autonomy, right? Like that's a massive amount of autonomy at that low level in the organization, early days of PayPal getting off the ground. Yes, I do think there's an opportunity to make 20% time, 100% time. Like you are doing what he's doing for the organization. That's not to say that everyone's just doing whatever the hell they want. The organization has a shared purpose that we all understand. We understand, who's doing what. You're not just running around doing whatever you want, but there's much more leeway to be creative at work and to do creative problem solving with the help of AI.
I love that vision that 20% time becomes 100% time. That's a huge kind of upgrade. And that's the kind of upgrade that he talks about at the beginning of the book.
Results only work environment, right? So you don't have to come in and punch the clock, blah, blah, blah. We all know what we're trying to achieve. Go do your part of it. Come back with that. And if you do other things at the same time, great. But as long as you do what we agreed, we're good. Do it how you want to do it and worry about the results. And by the way, it's not for everybody. I mean, in the anecdote in the book, he said that like that company who put in a row lost people who needed to be more directed. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Don't ask me to figure out what to do. Fine. There are jobs for people who just want to be told. But that's not the kind of organization I want to run.
Absolutely fantastic conversation. So glad you love this book and that we've talked about it in our thought leadership community and then we've had a chance to kind of summarize it here and share it with others. I think Dan Pink's got to listen to this because honestly, it's time for an update to this book, the 2024 edition that adds AI. So great to be with you, Roy. Really enjoyed the conversation. So many insights in one episode. I don't even need to actually ask you about one now. We just had so many along the way. I think the idea that the 20 will be 100, and that is a really good news story. I think that's part of what we're working with at Next CoLabs and the idea of instantiating something like a CoLabs in an organization to effectively do the practice piece, which is a big part of mastery. Maybe finish with just that idea of practice is probably the centerpiece of this entire kind of concept of AMP.
Yeah, that's why you and I are getting Next CoLabs off the ground, right? Like it is about putting AI into practice as a thought part, right? And it is not about reading a book about it. It's not about a strategy deck that you have people look at. This is much more like having a coach, not a coach in the sense of a particular thing, but about how do you instantiate AI as an active thought partner. At the moment, we've never hired a non-human player in our organizations, but now we need to. And in fact, every employee should have a non-human intelligence alongside them, assisting and amplifying what they're doing. And you need to practice that. And just like an Olympian, it doesn't really stop. Like we can ramp you up the curve, but it's asymptotic. You're never going to quite reach it. And why is that? Because AI is constantly evolving. I mean, look at what's happened in the last year of AI. If you just adopted AI in January of 2023 and then stopped, sorry, you just missed, a huge, and this is exponential curves and everything else as we've talked about before, but it never stops, right? So it's a constant practice and a getting better and an understanding that mastery comes with a consistent effort.
So powerful that this autonomy mastery purposes really maps to this moment.
It does. It really does.
On how to describe this sort of moment of dynamical change and how to navigate that as a AI-powered company or organization, the next generation of company. Absolutely amazing conversation. Honestly, I couldn't think of a better thought partner. As the CEO and as the founder of this company, absolutely loved the conversation and just great to have you here. Can't wait for the next conversation. Looking forward to doing that again soon.
Yeah, great seeing you.
All the best.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Next Insights podcast. If you enjoy this episode, take a screenshot and share it with a friend. And if you really love the podcast, head over to wherever you're listening and leave a rating or a review. This helps our show get in front of more people interested in shaping the future of science, technology, and consciousness. Finally, to receive even more insights on what we're discussing, thinking, and reading at Next CoLabs, sign up for our weekly newsletter by clicking the link in the show notes. I'll talk to you next week, but until then, consciously embrace disruption, my friends.